It's simply unacceptable at the 21st century to see that this amount of people are suffering and dying from a well-known disease, because malaria is very, very well-known.
You have children coming in with convulsions, high temperatures, children coming in so anemic that they look like white sheets and dropping dead in your presence.
There's two stages to malaria. The one, if you catch it, the one is you're afraid you'll die. The second stage is you're afraid you won't.
It's simply unacceptable to see these under 5 years suffering and dying for malaria.
Oh, sikhulekile ekhaya. Njengoba nje sihamba siqhuba umsebenzi wethu ojwayelekile ukuhamba sinivakashela la emakhaya. Sikhuluma ngomalalevevu. Ngakho nje zothi ukuxoxa kafushane, sixoxe ngomalalevevu, asibe sixoxe nangamaphilisi, bese sixoxa nangokufunda.
Malaria is a disease of underdevelopment. It creates poverty and it is caused by poverty. Malaria occurs in the poorest countries of the world, countries with the poorest infrastructure, and it occurs in people who are themselves very poor, have very little income to treat malaria or to prevent it. And the world has accepted this situation for too long. Most important preventable cause of mortality in young children in Africa.
Malaria is a curable disease. No one has got to die from this disease. It's easy to diagnose, it's easy to cure. We've got everything that we didn't have before. We've got the rapid test, and within 15 minutes we can diagnose precisely and be able to treat.
Insecticide-treated nets are wonderful and probably the best single tools we have to prevent malaria. More people are sleeping under bed nets in Africa today than ever before. Bed nets are cheaper than ever before, but the numbers actually sleeping under bed nets are way short of what we hope to achieve by 2005. Overall, we estimate that perhaps 10% of African children are sleeping under bed nets.
Yabona ayabida ngoba imindeni esinayo eminingi kakhulu. Thola ukuthi nginabantwana abawu10 ngingedwa.
Ebese kuthi imizini yethu lapha ezindlini ebese kuyafuthwa nasemachibini amachibi lawo afuthwe ngomuthi obulala abantwana bakamiyane.
I got a DDT for those huts which are made of mud.
Africa needs to use DDT to solve the malaria problem. But if it is used according to the guidelines, it's quite a perfect insecticide.
DDT, I regard it rather like a nuclear weapon, is to be kept in a cupboard and brought out as a last resort. We're still using DDT in some areas, but the idea is to get off it as soon as possible.
The problem is that the cost and the logistics, by and large, people can't spray their own house walls. You need backpack pumps, you need trained sprayers, the insecticides used tend to be fairly toxic, so this is not a do-it-yourself program. In scattered settlements in rural areas, it's quite difficult to get spray teams going to houses, and the cost increases very much more. So house spraying will work in rural tropical rural Africa, it has proven to be extremely expensive and very difficult to sustain.
Malaria is not going to be dealt with by one single control method, not by bed nets, not by spray, not by drugs, and it's going to take a combination of all of these things. But drugs are the only method we have today to actually treat people who have malaria. It's become more and more expensive to produce drugs. The total dollar numbers has gone up to many hundreds of millions of dollars to produce new drugs. With such large investment numbers, it's really difficult to justify doing it in any commercial sense unless there's quite a big potential return. And the world basically took its eye off the ball, stopped doing any innovation roughly in the 1970s, and here we are 30 years later, we have a real problem. And resistance has developed, as it always does in infectious disease, and now basically the drugs very often don't work at all. So what you need is continuous innovation for infectious diseases like malaria.
The aim of MMV cannot be to produce 1 or 2 new drugs. The aim has to be to come up with a new drug every 5 to 10 years, constantly, probably for the next 50 or 100 years.
These values are increased versus over what we saw in the rat, and they don't appear to
So what we need is a mechanism, a sustainable mechanism to come up with new drugs. And MMV is exactly in that role.
So we are demonstrating that it is possible, using public funds through this private-public partnership, to fund high-quality basic research that will lead eventually into a pharmaceutical product. It is a new way of doing things.
For the first time ever, really, there is now the potential of new funding going into developing countries, malaria-endemic countries, which potentially could be used to attract and to purchase the new anti-malarial drugs.
She's not a complicated case of malaria. She's not very ill. She's just feverish. Okay. We're going to give her Co-Artem. I'm just going to look at her weight, and it's an oral tablet, which I take for 3 days.
Of course, we've had problems with compliance, people taking the drug on the first day and feeling good and happy, and then they tend to forget.
So we had to do something which would give us the best shot at encouraging patients to take the drug not only properly, but to finish the whole course. This is an example of a child's dosage treatment, and here you see that the patient will be able to understand that her tablets, 1 dose, are to be taken when the sun comes up, the next one just before the moon. The next day she'll take another 2 when the sun comes up, and another 2 when the moon comes up, and so on and so forth until it's completed. As far as the education program is concerned, we've designed posters. For example, the child is sick. She's lying in bed. You can see a whole lot of mosquitoes here, so you know this child has got malaria. On day 1, she takes her first dose. On day 2, she's already feeling better. She's sitting up, so she stops her medicine. What happens then is the next day, the parasites start to build up again in the blood. And now she can't sit up anymore. She has to lie down because she's feeling poorly again. And this is an attempt to show patients why it's necessary to finish the full course of medicine. We've gone another step further, which is translating the whole thing into, from English, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Swahili. And this should cover the major endemic markets, which we know that this drug is going to be moving in.
I think the public, particularly in Europe and the US, essentially thinks it's a disease of the past, but in fact it's a disease that is as serious as, say, AIDS, which is a disease that people recognize as a huge problem today. It isn't a disease that kills middle-aged men. It isn't a disease that kills businessmen or policymakers or decision makers. And unfortunately, a lot of the children who die of malaria die quietly. Their deaths rarely get recorded.
A child is a child, no matter where that child is, no matter under what circumstances. A child in Africa, in Asia, is as important as a child in Europe and in America.
There has to be international solidarity and additional funding to support the costs of anti-malarial treatment.
I think it's very unwise to ignore a huge part of the world just because it's poor. I mean, one of the things I think that's happened sort of after September 11th, I think people are beginning to realize we all live in one world.
Malaria creates poverty. Malaria is a cause of poverty and a cause of underdevelopment. I think people in the West need to be extremely concerned about the continued underdevelopment of large parts of the world, particularly in Africa. And we know that underdevelopment goes hand in hand with insecurity and all of the other problems which can become a direct threat to the West. So it's not so much that people are going to catch malaria from Africa, but they may sort of catch the consequences of poverty and underdevelopment unless something is done about malaria in the fairly near future.
The biggest problem is the lack of money, but also the lack of awareness. It's simply unacceptable